Thank you and good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Case for Christmas broadcast. My name is Mark Middleberg, and on behalf of CCN, I want to welcome you from all over North America, churches and sites that are tuned in from Canada and all over the U.S. We're just so glad you're with us, and we're broadcasting here live from Calvary Church in Westlake Village, California. So it's great to be together. And I just want to say, whether you're already a committed Christian just looking for some information to sort of gird up your faith, or maybe you're a guest and you're saying, I don't know what to think of this. I don't know if this is true, if this is real. I don't know, I've got questions, I've got doubts, I've got objections. Either way, we want you to know you're welcome, and we trust that this will be beneficial to you. So we're really glad you're here. Now, I just want to say, you have questions throughout this broadcast as Lee speaks, and we just encourage you to write those questions down. And then throughout the broadcast, between now and toward the end, where we're going to have Q&A time, we're going to answer as many questions as we can get to. And you can take those questions and fax, phone, or email those into us. And the information numbers are at the bottom of your handout, so you can look at it there. Send those in, and we'll try to answer your questions. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have the privilege of introducing to you one of my favorite musicians on the whole planet. Neil Morse is just an incredible songwriter, singer, guitar player, and keyboardist. He's been rated as one of the top progressive rock musicians in the world. He's been the frontman for a group called Spock's Beard and an international supergroup called Transatlantic. Neil he's a rock and roll musician who became a Christian a few years ago. Unfortunately, we're going to hold him down a little bit tonight because this is a Christmas broadcast, but we've asked him to come and do a couple songs for you related to Christmas. So I'm thrilled to have him here with us. Would you welcome with me Neil Morse?
Dressed up for winter. Look at the snow blowing down my street. So glad to be home the entire season. So glad to be feeling what I cannot speak. Look at the house all dressed up for Christmas. Look at the kids, so sweet it hurts. The smell of the tree and the smoky firewood brings me back to a time that I thought was gone for good. Christmas keeps calling me back to my childhood, making me feel like I'm 9 years young. Back to my family, the house and the firewood. Christmas keeps calling me back where I belong. The church, feel the warmth that the people bring, and the children's smiles that mean everything. Oh, the love will flow and the bells will ring. Can't you hear them ringing? Christmas keeps calling me back to my childhood, making me feel like I'm 9 years young. Back to my family, the house and the firewood. Christmas keeps calling me back. It keeps calling me back. Christmas keeps calling me back to my childhood, making me feel like I'm 9 years young. my family. Oh, take me back, Lord. Christmas keeps calling me back where I belong.
I've always really enjoyed Christmas, I think like most of us. But in recent years, I've really come to know the spirit of the man behind the season. And it's given new life to a lot of these old songs that I've sung all my life, you know, but suddenly the words have a new meaning. Here's one y'all recognize, I'm sure. Sing glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. I said God and sinners reconciled. God and sinners reconciled. Joyful all ye nations rise. Oh, join the triumph of the skies with angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. The newborn King. The newborn King. The newborn King.
Well, I grew up hearing and singing a lot of Christmas carols, but rarely did I think much about what they said. Maybe you feel that way as well. I just have to force myself to stop and think about the words of Christmas songs. And when I do, it becomes clear that a lot of them really pack a punch in terms of what they're talking about. Just take the words to Hark the Herald Angels Sing. It speaks of things like, well, angels singing to shepherds, a virgin bearing a child, God being hidden in human flesh and referred to as incarnate deity, And it all culminates in this incredible promise that God and sinners can be reconciled. Well, those are huge claims for such a simple song. But those are some of the outrageous claims of Christmas. And you can hear it in 100 other Christmas carols and in 100,000 churches that sing them. But the question is, are those words true? How do we know? How do we evaluate this? Is this the stuff of Narnia, the stuff of Mordor and Middle-earth and Santa Claus and elves on the North Pole making toys for children? Or is there really a factual basis behind this? How do we know? Well, I think maybe we should ask the guy who wrote the book, The Case for Christmas. We've got him here today, Lee Strobel. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. He wrote the book, The Case for Christmas, which we've based this broadcast on today. He also wrote The Case for Christ, The Case for a Creator, and numerous other books. In fact, he's a New York Times best-selling author. Lee is known for speaking all over the world, live to audiences, as well as on radio and TV. But more interesting, perhaps, for this broadcast is Lee is a former atheist and skeptic who didn't believe any of the things we're talking about today at one time. He has a master's degree in studies of law at Yale Law School. He's an award-winning investigative journalist, and he was the legal affairs editor for the Chicago Tribune. So, needless to say, Lee's got the credentials and the experience to talk to us about these questions today and really help us to see the facts that underlie the Christmas holiday. So, would you welcome with me Lee Strobel?
Thanks, man. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I bring you today good tidings of great joy, because something unprecedented in human history is going to take place this December the 25th, if everything comes off on schedule. A baby is going to be born. But it's not just a typical baby, not your average baby. I'm talking about an extraordinary child. I'm talking about an amazing baby. I'm talking about a wonderful child, unlike any you've ever seen before. And relatives from all over the world are going to come, and they're going to put gifts at the feet of this little babe. Now, I have to admit, I'm a bit biased about this because, you see, this is going to be my first grandchild. My daughter Allison is pregnant, and she's supposed to give birth at Christmas. And, of course, this is a huge thing in the Strobel household. This is all we're talking about. But you have to know something. As wonderful and as precious as this baby is going to be, as much as we're going to treasure this child, none of us are going to bow down and worship him. And the reason, of course, is, as terrific as he's going to be, he's not God. And yet, 2,000 years ago, another child was born. And this Jesus has been able to convince hundreds of millions of people down through the centuries that he isn't just another human being, but that he is the one and only Son of God. And yet today we see controversy being stirred up afresh over this issue of the identity of that child. One of the best-selling books of recent years, called The Da Vinci Code, which is fiction but claims its historical facts are true, says that Jesus was a mere mortal and that nobody considered him to be the Son of God until the Roman Emperor Constantine made up that story about 3 centuries later for his own nefarious purposes. And Jesus continues to be controversial on college campuses. Chicago Tribune said this recently: "Scholarly debate is intensifying about who Jesus actually was, divine, human, or both. Jesus has been portrayed in a burst of books as, among other things, a cynic philosopher, an apocalyptic prophet, a zealot, a rabbi, a Pharisee, a feminist, a radical egalitarian, and a postmodern social critic." Now, we could spend our time today talking about some of the interesting sidelights about Christmas. We could talk, for instance, about, what's the actual date that Jesus was born on? And that's interesting to talk about. December 25th is probably not the date. because Luke says that there were shepherds in the fields, and that generally took place in the spring. And so actually around the year 200 AD, a bunch of theologians got together, and they tried to figure out as closely as they could when Jesus was born, and the year the day they came up with was actually May the 20th. So your kids can have two celebrations this year if you just want to celebrate May the 20th. It wasn't until the 4th century that Pope Julius I decided, well, maybe December 25th, since we don't know the exact date, would be a good day to celebrate it, because that's a date of a Roman holiday, and there's a lot of terrible things going on those holidays, and so this would give us something to counteract that immorality that takes place. Or we could talk about the Christmas star. The Christmas star is fascinating, too. I mean, what was that all about? Was that a comet? Was it an asteroid? Was it some sort of conjunction of planets? Some people think it might have been Halley's Comet, which was visible first in the west and then later in the east, but that would make Jesus' birth as early as 11 or 12 BC. Maybe that's not exactly right. I think maybe the best explanation has been offered by an astronomer by the name of Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross suggests that the star of Christmas was actually a recurring nova. A recurring nova is a star that grows bright for a while, and then it goes dim, and then it grows bright again, and then dim after a while, and so on. And so this is extraordinary enough that it would catch the attention of the stargazing magi who are really attuned to what's going on in the stars and in the sky, but it would be sufficiently unspectacular to escape the attention of average people. And a recurring nova would account for how Matthew says that the star appeared and then disappeared, and then appeared and then disappeared again. But those are interesting sidelights, and we could talk about those, but I'd like to do something else today. I'd like to drill down to the real core of what Christmas is all about. I want to spend our time exploring the identity of the child in the manger. Was he a mere human being, as I used to think when I was an atheist? Was he a mere prophet, as my Muslim friend in college told me? Or was he the unique Son of God, as Christians believe? After all, Jesus says this is the single most important issue of all time. Jesus said in John 8, verse 24, "If you do not believe that I am the one I claim to be, then you will indeed die in your sins." So Jesus is saying everything hinges on this issue of the identity of the child in the manger. It's that important. So what I'd like to urge all of us to do is what these shepherds did in that famous Christmas story that we see recorded in the 2nd chapter of Luke. And this is a story you're familiar with, where the angels appear to the shepherds in the field and make this amazing announcement that the Messiah, the Master, has been born in Bethlehem. What I love about that story is how the shepherds reacted to this incredible news. Did they just merely accept it and say, "Oh, okay, cool"? Or did they reject it out of hand? They didn't do either one. Listen to what the Bible says they did. They talked it over, and then they decided, let's get over to Bethlehem as fast as we can and see for ourselves what God has revealed to us. And then they left running to check out the evidence for themselves. And sure enough, seeing was believing, and they spread the news about the Christmas child far and wide. Well, every Christmas probably of your life, you've heard this outrageous claim that Jesus is God incarnate. And what I want to challenge you to do today is what those shepherds did 2,000 years ago. I want to encourage you with urgency to investigate the evidence for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Because as Jesus said, everything hinges on this issue. Well, as I described in my book, The Case for Christmas, it was my agnostic wife's conversion to Christianity and the subsequent positive changes I saw in her character and values that first encouraged me to investigate the evidence for Jesus. And as I did that, I focused on 3 particular issues, 3 particular questions that I'd like to talk about today. The first question is, do we have reliable records about Jesus? Secondly, did Jesus clearly claim to be God? And third, did Jesus offer credible credentials to back up his claim? Those are the 3 key issues we're going to talk about today. So the first issue is the reliability of the record. Can we trust what the New Testament tells us about what Jesus said and what Jesus did? I was an atheist, and so I approached this with extreme skepticism. But I have to tell you, after 2 years of investigation, my attitude was completely transformed by 3 strands of evidence that I call the 3 E's. The 3 E's. The first E stands for the word eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. I became convinced that there is good evidence that the New Testament can be traced back to the eyewitnesses Matthew, who was a disciple, and Peter, who was a disciple, and John, who was a disciple, and James, another eyewitness to the life of Jesus and the resurrected Christ, to Paul, another eyewitness to the resurrected Jesus, Mark, the close companion of the eyewitness Peter, and Luke, a meticulous historian and close companion of Paul, who was an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. In fact, they took great pains to state that they were only recording what they actually knew to be true, what actually took place. Peter said, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales." In other words, we didn't make up fairy tales when we made known to you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He said, "But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." We saw these things. John stressed that he was writing only about, quote, "what we have seen with our eyes, what we have beheld and our hands actually handled." This is concrete stuff, stuff we saw, stuff we experienced, stuff we touched. And Luke, who wrote a quarter of the entire New Testament, including probably the most thorough birth story that we have, said he carefully investigated everything from the beginning in order to write an orderly account of the certainty of what happened. Luke was I love this guy. He's sort of like a first century investigative reporter who went around and he made sure he had all the facts right. He talked to Mary. He talked to the key principals to make sure he had it all straight. These people had absolutely no motivation to lie. For all but one of the remaining disciples, the reward for proclaiming that Jesus is the unique Son of God was to be put to death, most often in horrific ways. The other disciple, John, was exiled to an island in order to die. Yet they never wavered in insisting that their accounts were absolutely true. Now, not only can the New Testament be traced back to eyewitnesses, but the second E stands for early accounts. Early accounts. In other words, that this was written down very soon after the events themselves. Because what I was taught in college was something very different. I don't know what you studied in college if you took a course on the historical Jesus as I did, but I was taught that, after Jesus died, the people who followed him sort of carried on an oral tradition for a long period of time. And during this long period of time, before it was actually written down, legend grew up and mythology grew up. And it so distorted and tainted the record that we can't trust what the Bible tells us when it talks about Jesus. Have you ever been told that? I mean, that's what I was taught. But that's not what the facts support. Let me sort of create a little, visual here on the stage. Pretend that this podium represents the year 33 AD, which is the year most likely that Jesus was executed. Now, a recent NBC documentary, it was on just recently, a few weeks ago, said that it was about 80 AD, that's 33 AD, this is 80 AD, when Matthew and Luke were written. And a lot of liberal scholars agree with that, although they would all agree as well that Mark was probably written in, say, 70 AD. So we have this time gap here, and what some theologians like to say is, well, it was during this time that legend grew up and turned a mere man, a mere mortal like Jesus, into the Son of God, that the idea that he was the Son of God did not come up till much later. Now, first I want to say, this is not such a long distance in terms of ancient times. I mean, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great, written by Arrian and Plutarch, are written 400 years after he lived, and they're generally considered to be reliable. Legend did develop, but it was generally in the time after that. And by the way, there were eyewitnesses who were alive in 80 AD who would have served as a corrective if what was being written down was wildly not true. In fact, one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford University, did a study at the rate at which legend grew up in the ancient world. And he determined that in the first century ancient world, that the passage of 2 generations of time was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So even if this documentary and these scholars are right, that Matthew and Luke and Mark were written about 70 and 80 AD, still, they can be considered trustworthy. But we can bring the events much closer to the life of Jesus. For instance, the Bible contains a book called the Book of Acts. It was written by Luke, this historian that I mentioned. This tells the story of the early church. Now, this is very interesting because at the end of the book of Acts, one of the main characters, the Apostle Paul, is put under house arrest. But you get to the end of the book and you don't know what happens to him. Why? Because the book was probably written before Paul was put to death. In fact, a whole bunch of things happened between 61 and 70 AD that would have been in Acts had Acts been written after they occurred. For instance, three of the principal characters in the early church, Paul, Peter, and James, were all put to death between 61 and 64 AD. In the mid-60s AD, Nero persecuted the church. It was a big thing. That certainly would have been in Acts if it had happened before Acts was written. And also, the Jewish-Roman War broke out in 66 AD. That would have been in Acts if Acts had been written after those things took place. So you see what I'm saying? These things would have been recorded in Acts if Acts had been actually written after they occurred. And yet they're not in there. Therefore, we could probably date the writing of the book of Acts to about 60 AD. But we can even go further than that, earlier than that, because even though the book of Acts affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God, we can go even closer to the event because Acts is the second part of a two-part work. The first part is the biography of Jesus by Luke called the Gospel of Luke. It also affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God. And so it must have come before Acts if Acts was written in 60 AD. So we can take it a step closer. Now, we also know that Luke used some of the writings of Mark in his writings as one of his references. So Mark, which also affirms that Jesus is a miracle-working, resurrected Son of God, must come even before Luke was written because he used it as a source. So now we go earlier still. We also know that the Apostle Paul wrote most of his letters before Mark wrote his gospel. These letters affirm that Jesus is the resurrected, miracle-working Son of God. And so now we can go even further, even closer to the life of Jesus. But Paul, in his writings, included these creeds and hymns of the earliest church that affirm the deity of Jesus. Philippians chapter 2, it says in one of these early creeds of the church that Jesus was in the very nature God. In Colossians chapter 1, another creed is recorded where it says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Another one is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following, that contains the essence of Christianity, that Jesus died. Why? For our sins, that he was buried, that he was resurrected on the third day, and then it mentions specific eyewitnesses whose lives were transformed by encountering the resurrected Jesus. This creed has been dated back by scholars from a wide range of theological belief to as early as 24 to 36 months after the life of Jesus, and the beliefs that make up that creed go right back to the cross itself. Friends, we don't have some huge expanse of time during which a mortal Jesus was mythologized into being the Son of God. Right back at the beginning, we have historical records that confirm in the most exalted terms that Jesus Christ is divine. Remember what I said about A.N. Sherwin-White? The passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have the passage of 2 generations of time. We have a news flash from ancient history. So, the New Testament can be trusted because it contains extraordinarily early accounts that weren't, destroyed by legendary development, and they're rooted in eyewitness testimony. On top of that, the third E stands for earmarks of authenticity. In other words, I looked at corroborative evidence that indicates a high likelihood that these documents are accurate. First, I studied archaeology, and I found that those facts in the New Testament that can be tested by archaeology time after time after time have been confirmed by archaeologists. In fact, there have been many instances where archaeologists would look at Luke and say, well, Luke's got things messed up. Luke's wrong about these references. We know that from archaeology, and we can't trust him. And then time after time, we find out that it was Luke who was right and the archaeologists who had been wrong. I'll give you an example involving Christmas. Luke describes the census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem and says it was conducted when Quirinius was governing Syria and during the reign of Herod the Great. Now, historians used to look at that and say, well, see, Luke doesn't know what he's talking about, because everybody knows Herod died in 4 BC, and Quirinius didn't begin ruling Syria until 10 years later. So their reigns didn't overlap, as Luke said. He's wrong. You can't trust what he said. But a few years ago, an eminent archaeologist by the name of Dr. Jerry Vardaman found a coin with what archaeologists call micrographic letters, which simply means very tiny writing, that proved that Quirinius was proconsul of Syria from 11 BC until after the death of Herod. In other words, there were either 2 Quiriniuses, it's a fairly common name, so that's a possibility, or Quirinius governed Syria at 2 separate times. But the point is, Luke was right. And that archaeological discovery showed us once more how careful he was as an historian. In fact, both liberal and conservative historians both will tell you that Luke was very careful and very accurate about what it is that he recorded. Australian archaeologist Clifford Wilson said, "Those who know the facts now recognize that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book." The second earmark of authenticity for the New Testament is that it contains all kinds of embarrassing material about the disciples. Things like their unbelief and their cowardice and their grandiosity and even their stupidity. And then there are these hard-to-explain sayings of Jesus that would have been embarrassing to his culture. Things like his attitudes toward sinners and toward women and toward legalism and his displays of anger. And here's the point. If the writers of the New Testament were inclined to manipulate or whitewash the record, surely they would have edited out this embarrassing material. But the material is in the Bible, which is simply more evidence of their desire to be complete and to be accurate, even if their own image was tarnished in the process. Third, I looked at writings outside the Bible to see if they contradict or they confirm what the New Testament tells us. In his book, The Historical Jesus, a friend of mine, Dr. Gary Habermas, documents 39 ancient sources for the life of Jesus from outside the Bible, including 17 non-Christian sources, which together report over 100 facts about the life, teachings, miracle, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so key aspects of the New Testament are corroborated by writings independent of the Bible. Friends, when I hold the New Testament of the Bible, I am holding a reliable record about Jesus Christ and about the early church. And that's just not my opinion. British scholar R.T. France said, "We have good reasons to treat the gospel seriously as a source of information on the life and teachings of Jesus, and thus on the historical origins of Christianity." In fact, even the critical German scholar Peter Stuhlmacher told Time magazine recently, "The biblical texts as they now stand are the best hypothesis we have until now to explain what really happened." In other words, who was really in that manger on the first Christmas. So this first question, do we have reliable records about Jesus, is answered with the resounding yes. Yes, we do. So now let's look at what those records tell us about what Jesus claimed about himself. We're going to go to the second question. Did Jesus clearly claim to be the Son of God? The Da Vinci Code, remember the book I mentioned earlier? It says no, he didn't. It says, quote, "Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal." It says Jesus wasn't declared God until this idea was made up some 300 years later for nefarious purposes. But what does the historical record actually show? Well, let's go back to the very earliest biography we have about Jesus. That would be the Gospel of Mark, the earliest one, and see what it says. Well, what we find as we open up the book, the New Testament, we look at the Gospel of Mark. Some people say, well, here's evidence that Jesus only considered himself to be a mere human being. Because if you look at Mark, what you notice is most often the most common way Jesus referred to himself was the Son of Man. So he's called himself a Son of Man. He's in other words, emphasizing his humanity. And so this idea that he's God must have developed in mythology and legend a long time later. But actually, the opposite is true. Because the Son of Man is actually a reference to the Old Testament book of Daniel in the 7th chapter, where the Son of Man is a divine figure who has authority and glory and sovereign power, who receives worship from all people. Only God is worship, remember? And who will come at the end of the world to judge humankind and to rule forever. In other words, Jesus' claim to being the Son of Man is actually a claim to divinity. And by the way, there is a reference in Mark where Jesus is specifically called the Son of God. But one of my favorite claims to deity in this earliest gospel, this Gospel of Mark, is often overlooked. You might remember that Mark in chapter 6 tells the story of Jesus walking across the water. And as he walks across the water, he says to his disciples, if you read the Bible, he says, "Fear not, it is I." Well, that's not exactly what he said. Because if you look at the original Greek, it's the language in which the New Testament was written, that kind of masks the actual words of Jesus. Jesus didn't actually say, "Fear not, it is I." What Jesus said was, "Fear not, I am." Fear not, I am. What was he doing there? When he said, "I am," he was applying to himself the divine name, I am, which is what God used to reveal himself to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. So, again, Jesus was clearly claiming that he's God. He's revealing himself as the one that with the same divine power over nature, able to walk on water, as the Old Testament talks about God himself. Also in Mark, when Jesus is being tried, the high priest asks him point blank, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And the first two words out of his mouth are, "I am." And then he said, "And you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." So again, this is a reference to that divine passage in Daniel. So what's the reaction when he says this? Immediately, the high priest understands what Jesus is saying. Immediately, he declares blasphemy. Why? Because he knows Jesus obviously is declaring himself to be God, and that is blasphemy. So his audience knew exactly what he was saying when he made that claim to be God. All through the Gospels, we see this happening. In John 10, verse 30, Jesus declares outright, "The Father and I are one." And if you study that word in the Greek, what it means is one in essence. We are one in essence. And his audience, what did they do? They immediately picked up stones to try to stone him to death for blasphemy because listen to what they say. "You, a mere man, claim to be God." It was clear to them he was making that assertion. There was no ambiguity. Also, Jesus forgave sins. Only God can do that. Jesus accepted worship. Only God can be worshiped. When Jesus asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus didn't correct him. Instead, he affirmed that this was revealed to him by the Father. British theologian John Stott put it this way. He said, "Jesus made it absolutely clear by word and by deed that to know him is to know God. To see him is to see God. To believe in him is to believe in God. To receive him is to receive God. To reject him is to reject God. And to honor him is to honor God." Friends, we have reliable records about the life of Jesus Christ. And in those records, Jesus makes the clear claim that he is the unique Son of God. But you know what? That's not quite enough, is it? Because anybody can make a claim like that. I mean, just saying something doesn't make it true. If I came in here and said, "I'm George Bush," you'd say I was crazy. But if George Bush came in here and claimed to be George Bush, you wouldn't say he was crazy. You would say he's telling the truth. Why? Because there would be corroborating evidence to confirm his identity. He would look like Bush. He would talk like Bush. He'd swagger like Bush. He'd have Secret Service protection like Bush and media coverage, and his orders would be carried out by the federal government and on and on. He would back up his claim to being George Bush with credible credentials. And so that leads us to the third question. Did Jesus offer credible credentials to back up his divine claims? Well, I believe the evidence is overwhelming that he did. And I'll just mention quickly 4 categories of this confirming information. First, his miracles. Jesus said something very interesting in John chapter 10, verse 37. He said, "Don't believe me unless I do miracles of God." In other words, he was saying miracles would be strong confirmation to his identity. In fact, hundreds of years before the first Christmas, the prophet Isaiah said miracles would be one way the Messiah would authenticate himself. So Jesus performed many miraculous feats in broad daylight, oftentimes in front of skeptics. He demonstrated power over nature by walking on water. He demonstrated power over sickness by healing leprosy and blindness. He demonstrated power over death by raising Lazarus from the dead. In fact, Jesus' opponents never denied that he performed miracles. In fact, the ancient Jewish writings called the Talmud, even though they say negative things about Jesus, the Talmud concedes, admits that he dealt in the supernatural. Even Muhammad, the founder of Islam, admitted that Jesus performed the miraculous, and by the way, that Jesus also was born of a virgin. The second credential of Jesus is his character. You know, so often, the closer we get to other people, the more we see their flaws. When I was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and I would, spend time with politicians or celebrities and so forth, the closer I would get to them, the more I would see that they have shortcomings just like everybody else. And yet, amazingly, the opposite is what happened for those who knew Jesus. The closer they got to him, the more they marveled at his moral perfection. For instance, nobody was closer to Jesus during his ministry than John and Peter. They saw Jesus up close and personal 24/7 virtually. So what was their assessment of Jesus' character? John wrote in 1 John 3, verse 5, "In him is no sin." And Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, "He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth." I mean, how many of us would have that said about us of people who are close to us? None of us would. And yet, this righteous character of Jesus is confirmed by those who are closest to him, and it is another credential of him being who he claimed to be. The third credential that Jesus offered was the way he fit the fingerprint of divine prophecy. You see, the Old Testament of the Bible contains dozens of specific ancient predictions or prophecies about the coming Messiah who would be sent. So Jesus fits this fingerprint, unlike anybody else. Now, I used to think that, well, maybe a way to explain this is that Jesus intentionally maneuvered his life in such a way as to, pretend to fulfill these predictions and fool people into thinking he's the Messiah. So maybe like when he was getting ready to go into Jerusalem, he told his disciples, "Look, go find me a donkey, because Zechariah 9:9 says the Messiah is going to ride a donkey into Jerusalem, and I'm really anxious to fool him to think I'm the Messiah so I can be tortured to death here. So would you go get me a donkey so I can fool everybody?" I thought maybe that kind of explained it away. But then I saw that, gosh, there's a whole bunch of these prophecies that there's no way Jesus could have intentionally fulfilled. How could he arrange for his place of birth or his ancestry or how he was betrayed? Sources outside the Bible of various quality and various dates and so forth that Dr. Habermas talks about in his book, The Historical Jesus. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one that specifically corroborates that particular fact. But if you take the contours of what that non-biblical evidence paints, it's a very consistent picture of what we see in the New Testament.
Right. Okay, what about the prophecy in Isaiah 7 about the Messiah? It talks about him being born of a virgin.
Yeah.
I know there's some debate on that whole question of the word virgin in the Old Testament.
Yeah. I actually deal with that in the case for Christmas. It's a linguistics issue. And there are some, I won't get into, there's two words. Alma is one, and Bethula is another, or they're Hebrew words. And the question is this: if they intended the word, the concept of virginity to be communicated, which word would they have used? And the skeptics say, well, they would have used this other word because the word that they did use merely means a young woman. Well, you think about that. The prophecy is that a young woman would have a child. That's not much. I can predict that. My daughter's going to have a child. I mean, she's fairly young, so I mean, that's no big deal.
You're no prophet.
And I'm no prophet, that's for sure. So, on the other hand, there's a historian by the name of Glenn Miller, and he looked at all of the most recent historical data. And his conclusion is, and I talk about this in my book, that the word that is used by Isaiah in this prophecy is the exact word that you would use if the intention of virginity is there. Because the other word that the critics want to use is sometimes used of non-virgins, of people who were divorced or widowed, so they may not have been virgins. So probably weren't. So my point is the correct word, according to the best linguistic evidence we had, was used.
Well, it's interesting, too, that the writers of the New Testament were Hebrew people that lived 2,000 years earlier than the critics.
Yeah, that's true.
And they were probably in the best position to know what the words of the Old Testament meant, and they clearly interpreted it to mean virgin and report that, and of course then the story of Mary being a virgin that has a child. Yeah. Now, another question related says, were the Jews of the day really anticipating a Messiah that would be born of a virgin? Someone that was a god from the very beginning. In other words, were they looking for that? Were they waiting for someone like that? Or just someone who would be anointed like King David? Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll start on that. It's interesting when you go to these passages in Isaiah 7:14, where it says that a virgin will be with child and give birth to a son. It says, and they will call his name Emmanuel. And if you look in other places in the Old Testament, it's very clear that word Emmanuel means God with us. So there was right in the prophecy of this virgin having a son, it says he would be called God with us. And then just a few verses later in Isaiah 9:6, very famous passage, it says, to us a child is born, a son is given, the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, etc. Yeah. So again, right here in the prophecies in Isaiah, written, this is important to realize, 700 plus years before these events, predicting the birth of the Messiah of a virgin, and it called him Emmanuel, God with us, called him Mighty God. So it's pretty powerful.
A good answer.
Yeah, well, I'd also add, I think it's important for us to distinguish between what the Jews of the day, when we say the Jews of the day anticipated, which Jews of the day? Yeah. Because there's, kind of the general populace, which may or may not have really understood what Scripture's taught, versus the prophets and what they actually did say and the people that really understood them. Yeah. And so I think there were a lot of things really clearly predicted by prophets if someone really went to the effort of reading and studying and comprehending what they said. And often, let's face it, then and now, a lot of people don't go to that effort. Yeah. So I think a lot of times they didn't anticipate the Messiah coming and doing what he was predicted to do because they didn't know the Scriptures or hadn't really looked at them in that way. Here's a question from Paul in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Messiah Lutheran Church. And this one's for you, Lee. Regarding your pre-61 AD dating of Luke's book of Acts, how would you address the response or the challenge that his focus was on the victorious advancement of the good news from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, etc., rather than anything that would detract from that positive picture, that view of that advancement. In other words, maybe he left out the death of Paul and Peter and all these things.
That'd be a downer.
It was a downer. This is bad news. We want to really kind of leave on a good note here.
Right. I look at Luke's intention. I look at what Luke was about. He was about carefully recording what actually took place, whether or not it helped his case or hurt his case. Look at the example of the women discovering the tomb empty. That hurt his case in the first century. He reported it that way. It was a downer. It's like, well, what are we going to do? But that's what happened.
Well,
I'm going to be
honest. Let me add a couple of others. First of all, Paul was in prison at this time, so it's not like a big triumphant deal. True. He's in chains. In Acts chapter 5, he records the death of Ananias and Sapphira in church for lying, and boom, they drop dead. That's probably
a lot of negative stuff.
Yeah, the stoning of Stephen and other examples could be given. So I think you're right.
And the fact that they mention the stoning of Stephen, is an example that they're going to, if you have the people that are major figures in this early church movement of Peter, Paul, and James, we have recorded Stephen's death. We certainly would have recorded those deaths as well. And the Roman Jewish War, the persecution by Nero, these were major, major things. One of the reasons, frankly, Mark, that I think that some scholars date the Gospels later is because Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD. And they say, well, he couldn't have predicted that. You know, how could a person have predicted that? There's no way. So this must have been written after 70 AD. And my point is, if Jesus is who he claimed to be,
Right.
if he is the Son of God, he easily could have predicted the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
That's something we really have to watch out for, because a lot of people make these decisions based on a presupposition that supernatural things like prophetic knowledge aren't real.
Yeah.
Therefore, it couldn't have been, therefore it was later,
Right.
which isn't the scientific way of figuring out these things, obviously. Lee, one other thing you said in your talk, you said that the Bible reports history as it happened, even if it hurt its own reputation or hurt the reputation of Jesus or his followers. And you said, including Jesus' view of women.
Yeah.
Clarify that.
Yeah,
what you
Jesus had a radical view of women in the first, revolutionary view of women in the first century. He elevated women, unlike other religious figures of his day. So he certainly elevated them. For instance, Mary Magdalene was a disciple of Jesus. It's the only thing you consider her, really, is a disciple. So, he had a positive and affirming view of women.
Okay, I just want to make sure we were clear on which way
Yeah,
you meant that.
yeah.
So here's a few kind of detailed questions about Christmas. One question here is, what was the significance of frankincense and myrrh? You study on that one?
You probably know
In
it.
case not, I looked it up.
Oh,
while I was
good.
in the back.
I can't remember. People like to ascribe certain things that the wise men brought and ascribe certain meaning to each of those. I can't remember what they are. Do you remember?
Well, I just did a very straightforward definition. Frankincense was a sweet-smelling incense that was considered very valuable in its day. And then myrrh was actually a sap from a myrrh bush that was a precious anointing oil. And if you know the stories about Jesus, where the woman once broke a vial of oil and perfume and poured it over his feet, and that was a great sacrifice, a great act of worship, because anointing oil was a very valuable and rare commodity in those days. So these were rare and valuable gifts that these wise men brought to give to Jesus, and it showed their high view of him and his importance.
Pastors have built entire sermons around the meaning of those things.
Yeah,
which is interesting. It's good stuff.
maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I
Here's one
barely
from
slept through 'em.
Here's one from Jessica in Texas, a Baptist church there. She said, "I don't understand why we celebrate Jesus' birthday on December 25th if it's probably actually in May."
Well, it's very interesting. One of the reasons, this is fascinating, one of the reasons the earliest followers of Jesus didn't have a birthday that they knew, they didn't care. And the reason they didn't care is they knew that was not when Jesus was created. That's not when Jesus entered into the world. Jesus was eternal. He always existed. This was just when he was incarnate. So they didn't really care when the date was. And so nobody kept track. And so finally, about 200 AD, some theologians got together in Egypt and said, well, maybe we ought to try to figure this out. And they figured, some said March, some said April. The best date they came up with was May 20th. But Julius I, the Pope in the 4th century, the reason he chose that date, since we don't know what it is, and it is conceivable, it is possible that it's December 25th. There are a couple of early church fathers who did think it was that date. And there's in the ancient Jewish writings called the Mishnah, there is a reference to shepherds being in the field in December. So it's not totally impossible this December 25th. But what Pope Julius I said basically was, hey, you got this, there are a lot of celebrations on December 25th. You got the winter solstice and all that stuff going on. There was a Roman celebration of a god, and it was characterized by immorality and all sorts of drunkenness. And his thing was, hey, if we're going to celebrate, let's celebrate on that day and bring some goodness. Bring some positive.
Now, a lot of people, though, would jump on that and say, aha, see, it's a pagan holiday. It's pagan roots.
No, it's an effort by Christians to bring a Christian message into a pagan culture.
Which really is a good picture of what God does in our own lives. I mean, he takes pagans like us.
Yeah,
and,
especially you.
Yeah, well. You want to finish my sentence?
No, it's right.
You get my point. Okay. That just stopped me in my tracks there. Did the wise men, I don't know if you'd know this, Lee, but did the wise men travel together or meet up in Bethlehem? And how many were there? Were there 3 or 4?
We don't know how many there were. It doesn't say 3. I don't believe in the Bible. 2 of them took Air France, which I think is interesting. Because they fly those 747s, and one went British Air, and the other ones I'm not sure. No, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that's recorded.
Okay, yes, this is degenerating quickly. How about this one? You mentioned the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah. By the way, we're doing a big outreach event on the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, I'm going to give the details
Okay,
on that
great.
later, but that is, obviously there's so many questions in our culture about the Da Vinci Code and what it raises about Jesus and the historicity of the Bible and the claims of Jesus' deity and so on. We want to really address those in a broadcast. But here's one that comes up in the Da Vinci Code, but you often hear this, that Christianity, really the stories of Jesus, the virgin birth, the details of his crucifixion and resurrection and so on, is based on myth. And specifically in the Da Vinci Code, it talks about the Mithra cult, which according to ancient beliefs, Mithra was born of a virgin in a cave on December 25th, accompanied by shepherds, and grew up to be a mighty teacher with 12 disciples.
And was resurrected from the dead, supposedly.
Resurrected, yeah. This all happened ahead of time. See, Christianity just borrowed its information from these cults, and it's all made up.
Yeah. This is such a crock.
How do you really feel about this?
This really annoys me. Back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, this was very popular among certain liberal scholars to make these suggestions, that Christianity is nothing new. They borrowed it all from these ancient myths. It was answered by Christians in about the 1930s and afterwards. It was completely answered, and virtually there's no scholars today who hold to it. But people have gone back on the internet and found those old writings, and now they bring it up and say, hey, what about this, and so forth. I'll give you the quick one on Mithra. Was Mithra born on December 25th? Well, that's what it says, and it does predate Christianity. The problem is Jesus probably wasn't born on December 25th, so there's no problem there. Was Mithra born of a virgin? No. Mithra was carved out of a cave, out of the rock. So if the rock was a virgin, I suppose, then that's been born of a virgin. But the myth says that Mithra came out of a rock. So that's not anything to do with Christianity.
Sounds like cartoons I've seen.
Like a cartoon thing. Was Mithra accompanied by shepherds? Yes. Shepherds came and assisted in the birth. The problem is that part of Mithraism postdates Christianity. So that was probably taken from Christians. That is not
so
part
that was
of the,
added to the
That
story
was added later after Christianity. Did Mithra have 12 disciples? No. I challenge anybody to find any ancient reference he had 12 disciples. The Iranian Mithra beliefs said he had one. The Roman Mithra beliefs said he had two. Was he resurrected from the dead? Again, go back to the original sources. There is not one source that will say he was resurrected from the dead. So a lot of the stuff is either made up, or they take Christian terminology and apply it to something which is not Christian and make it sound like for instance, Mithra, they had a baptism. They used to baptize people. Oh gosh, that sounds like Christianity. Well, no, what they do is they would take a bull and they would put the new convert under a bull, and they would slit the bull open and let the blood rain down on this person. Has that got, and they call it baptism today, they'll call it that. Well,
doesn't sound like any Baptist churches I've been in.
No, it has nothing to do with the Christian concept of baptism. So this stuff, when you see it brought up, demand to see the original sources, and you'll see that there are no real parallels.
Okay. Lee, someone named Mark.
Got 5 minutes.
Another Texas one here. I have a few friends that I've tried to talk about these things. It's hard for them to listen because they say they just don't care.
No.
It's just like, so what?
Yeah.
What verses or what advice would you have to give
I've used the verse that Jesus himself said, if you don't believe I am the one who I claim to be, you'll die in your sins. And he doesn't mean that in a condemning way. He means that's the reality is our sin, our wrongdoing creates a distance between us and God. He's perfect and holy. We're not. And if we don't care, Mark, if say, I don't care if I'm distant from God, doesn't bother me, then God will allow us to have that distance in this lifetime. And when we die, he will, stamp that and say, you made your choice. And in eternity, we'll be distant from him forever. That's what hell is, distant from any influence of God forever.
Don't you think, Lee, that a lot of people say they just don't care, they just don't grasp the gravity of what we're talking about?
The gravity and the reality of it. If they would just say the word maybe.
Yeah.
Just say maybe. Maybe this is true. That's what I said when I was a seeker. Maybe it's true. Maybe
it's
there's
the
some
shepherds that
credibility.
hear the
What
angels.
the shepherds said, exactly.
Let's check
if
it
they
out.
would just say maybe, and let this be the Christmas that they investigate the facts for themselves.
It's good advice. Well, we're almost out of time, Lee, so let's just talk about a few things that could be further resources for people. In fact, I know you put together a resource sheet that you should have in your handouts. We'd encourage you to look at that for further information, to do more research. If you do what Lee just said, you say maybe. Well, now you got to do some looking. The shepherds had to get up and go into the town of Bethlehem, and they had to go look and see and say, does
And it was
this make
urgent.
sense?
It was important.
They ran. Yeah, exactly. So we just want to urge you, look at those resources on that page, including, as we've mentioned, the book that this whole broadcast is based on, the Case for Christmas book. And check that out. Now, if you want to just look at an excerpt and get a feel for that book, there's a website, caseforchristmas.com. And you can go on that website. I guess there's part of the first chapter, the
free
introduction.
excerpt.
Take a look. You can pick up the book in Christian bookstores or get it online or whatever. But I'd encourage you, and again, for those friends that are saying, I don't know, does this matter? Is this important to me? It ought to matter enough to read a 98-page book about it and say, maybe, does this make sense for me? Furthermore, CCN really believes in the importance of this message and in what we're talking about in this broadcast. And I'm so excited that they've decided to make a DVD of this entire broadcast and make it available, and they're producing it very quickly so that it'll be something you can get very soon. And normally DVDs are like $22. I think it's like $9.95 that they're making it available, because many of you, as you watch, you may be saying, man, there was a lot of information that Lee flew through so quickly and during the questions and answers. I wish I could hear that again. Well, you may want to get this DVD and watch it, or you may have a friend that you're thinking, man, if only he or she had been here, then they could have heard this. Well, maybe you want to pick up the DVD and give it to them. So I just wanted to let you know that that is available as well. We mentioned this Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Talk about that broadcast, Lee.
Yeah, we're going to do that on May the 21st. And it's live from a church in Orange County. And we're going to have Dr. Erwin Lutzer, who has written a book on this topic, tremendous communicator, to really be able to respond to the movie, which is coming out that weekend, and the book, and try to set the record straight. Yeah. And also look about some of the positive things that we can learn from this experience. So that should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the importance of that, because this Da Vinci Code thing is being read. It's almost the counterpart to Purpose-Driven Life. I mean, there are so many people reading it and getting opposite kinds of information. And I don't know if you've read it, but I mean, it really has some information, if it were right, that would be devastating to the church and to church history and to the claims of Christ. And it's got a lot of problems, and we want to take those on head on. And we're going to do that, again, Sunday night, May 21st, which is the opening weekend of this movie, and it's going to be a big release movie.
Yeah.
Ron Howard is producing it.
Tom Hanks is starring.
Tom Hanks. So we would encourage you to put that date down on your calendar and join us on May 21st. Last thing I just want to say is I want to thank my friend Neil Morse for being here with us. Neil, I mentioned at the beginning, this guy is an incredible musician. We've held him down a little bit here, but you've gotten a pretty good taste of it. He plays with some of the top rock musicians in the world, guys from Dream Theater and other groups, and they play on his albums. He does everything from worship to progressive rock and roll. You can go to his website, neilmorris.com. But we really appreciate you, Neil, being with us. We're thrilled about what God's been doing in your life and now through your music and through your ministry. And we're going to end with Neil kind of taking us out with a little instrumental song. So thanks, Neil. Thank you all,
for
being here. God bless you. Have a great Christmas.